Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for dialing on to our webinar on how to deliver net zero credibly this afternoon. I'm just going to give it another minute or two because we have quite a few people dialing on this afternoon. So I will just mute myself just for another minute as we allow people to dial on. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for dialing in for our webinar this afternoon as part of Net Zero Week, where we're going to be discussing how we can start to deliver net zero credibly. I am delighted to be joined this afternoon by a very prestigious panel. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Andrew Kidd, LTC Director of Environmental Sustainability with National Highways, Dr. Owen Devan, who's the Acting Director responsible for Net Zero at the UK Government's Climate Change Committee, and last but by no means least, Julia Baker, Global Lead for Biodiversity and Nature at Mock McDonald. Thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon. I really appreciate you making the time and sharing your expertise with everyone that's dialing on today. So I'll begin just with a little bit of housekeeping so everybody is aware. Firstly, the session is being recorded and the recording will be available on the Net Zero Week website after today. All of you are in listen mode only, but we have a Q&A open. For any questions that you wish for me to put to the panelists as part of this afternoon's debate, please do type them into the chat and use the like function if there are questions that pop up that you would particularly like to see answered. I'm anticipating quite a few questions coming through, so we are going to be prioritizing the ones that get a double thumbs up. So if you like the sound of that question, please do give it a thumbs up. And, finally, do please put forward, there's no such thing as a bad question. Whatever burning question you want answered, please do put that in the chat. So for our session this afternoon, we will begin with some opening remarks from myself, before then looking at the three themes that we're going to unpack today as part of our discussion around how we can deliver net zero. Firstly, how net zero will be judged by delivery rather than declaration, so how we can shift from target setting to practical delivery on the ground, how sustainability in itself, as alongside net zero, requires that whole systems thinking approach, and whether or not we're being too blinkered in our thinking around carbon, before then finally looking at how we need to scale the delivery of net zero and focusing on key priorities that we know work on the ground. As I said, I will begin with some opening remarks before then moving into the Q&A session with our panelists. So for much of the last decade, the net zero debate has been dominated by targets. But the next decade, I believe, will be defined by delivery. The question facing organizations today is no longer whether they support net zero, it's how we deliver the transition credibly. How do we turn commitments into outcomes? How do we move from ambition to action? And how do we do so in a way that is practical, affordable, and critically trusted? Balfour Beatty is at the heart of the net zero transition, delivering infrastructure that will play a critical role in the UK's transition to a low carbon economy. But today's discussion is not primarily about the infrastructure we build. It is about how we, as organizations, decarbonize ourselves and how we demonstrate that progress credibly. Because as the focus shifts from targets to delivery, credibility will become the test. Ultimately, having credibility comes down to trust. Trust that emissions are genuinely falling, that environmental gains are real, and that trade-offs are being managed responsibly. And trust that organizations are prepared to be transparent, not only about where we are succeeding, but also where challenges remain. That means thinking carefully about how we define success. Reducing carbon emissions remains absolutely critical, but we must avoid carbon tunnel vision. The test is not simply whether an intervention reduces carbon in one place or whether it contributes to a genuinely better outcome overall. That means considering nature and biodiversity alongside carbon. It means thinking about business resilience, resource use, affordability, social value. And it means recognizing that sustainability is ultimately about balancing these objectives rather than optimizing for one in isolation. The challenge is scale. Many of the solutions already exist, whether that's lower carbon materials, alternative fuels, digital carbon management tools, circular economy approaches, or nature positive design principles. These exist. The question is increasingly not whether they work, but about how quickly we can embed them across our operations and supply chains. Too often we focus on finding the next innovation before fully scaling the solutions that we know already deliver results. The real opportunity lies in applying proven approaches consistently, making them standard practice rather than isolated success stories, but that requires collaboration. No organization will achieve net zero in isolation. For most businesses, the majority of emissions sit beyond their direct control across supply chains, materials, and wider value chains. Progress depends on working together to create the consistency, confidence, and accountability needed to drive change at scale. Ultimately, the next phase of net zero will not be defined by who sets the most ambitious targets. It will be defined by who can deliver meaningful, measurable, and lasting change. That is the challenge facing every organization represented here today, and it is the challenge that we will explore over the next hour. And I'm looking forward very much to hearing the perspectives of our panel. Owen, Julia, Andrew, welcome. I'm going to begin with an open question to all of you. Julia, I'm going to come to you first, if I may. So let's imagine that we've reached 2030. What tangible evidence or outcomes do you think need to be in place, delivered by businesses, that will convince people, the average person, that net zero is being delivered credibly and that we're actually reducing our carbon emissions?
Firstly, thank you very much, Jo. I think you just summed it up incredibly well. You know, I'd like to acknowledge as the trailblazer of the net zero community, incredibly just what you've achieved to date, and then continually raising the bar from ambition to delivery. And your question about 2030 rhymes very well with nature, because it's quite a milestone for our nature target as well, in terms of reaching that positive stage. We are in one crisis. It's one nature and climate crisis. And I think there's an element of getting the net zero foundations right, nature in that sense right, and we're moving from biodiversity and gain. You talked about nature positive, but I'm seeing more and more a groundswell of hunger and movement to bring those two together. And I think to answer your question, what does 2030 look like? We understand the biodiversity consequences of the actions to get to net zero, but we also understand how the land carbon sequestration and storage change under something like biodiversity net gain. And then we bring the two together to say, overarchingly, are we heading in the right direction? Because I worry that we think we're making progress when we're not, because we're not measuring everything together. And I think over the next 2 years, it's really what you're talking about understanding the trade-offs. We can no longer pursue these independent ambitions, as right as they might be. We have to start bringing them together, understanding those trade-offs, and by 2030 having that picture of the jigsaw puzzle, so we truly have confidence that we're moving in the right direction.
I think you're absolutely spot on, that there is a growing understanding, isn't there, that we can't avert climate catastrophe without also restoring the nature that we've destroyed historically. I think the challenge is whether we're going to learn that lesson quick enough to rebalance the equation, as you say. Thank you, Julia. Andrew, what do you think needs to be in place so that we can really start to wave the flag of credibility around net zero reduction?
Well, if I give you a perspective very much from my own work on the Lower Thames Crossing, obviously close to home, and I think it's super practical as well. About 3 years ago, we declared as a Pathfinder program for carbon neutral construction. And we went through a process of trying to work out what that meant, and we made commitments. In fact, our commitments are legally binding commitments. And we've been working on this now for 3 years plus. But most of what we've done actually is paperwork. We can tell you what our plans are, but we haven't enacted them. The difference you get by 2030 is that it's very, very real, and it's on a big construction site, and you can see it, and you can bring people to see it. And if there's one thing I've learned working on this agenda, actually, people find it very hard to imagine what a low carbon future looks like. And seeing really is believing. So I think that will be a massive change. And we will go from today having 10 what we call zero emissions, but electric or hydrogen fueled machines operating on our sites to having 110. You'll be able to see carbon neutral concrete being poured, low carbon steel on our site. Where today we have the results of a low carbon bridge competition, actually you'll be able to come and see the bridge. So, absolutely a process of making things real and giving people really, really tangible things that they can take away and implement elsewhere.
I think that's such an invaluable point about tangible. Whenever, if we have conversations about carbon with some of our operatives on the ground, I think the hardest thing is people can't see it. They can't see it, they can't touch it, they can't feel it. Whereas having a project like Lower Thames, where you can actually, drive across it, walk across it, feel it, it's a physical thing that is real, will hopefully really start to show people the art of the possible.
And I think the amazing thing that comes with it actually is in the people. A large supply chain of individuals and companies who have worked out little bits of this puzzle, and they can all take that philosophy or take those actions on to wherever they go next.
Absolutely. And Owen, obviously from, you're looking at the gap between, commitment and delivery, but you're looking at it from the UK perspective rather than from an organizational perspective like Julia and myself, or a project perspective like Andrew. So you're the next macro level up. What do you think needs to be delivered in a tangible sense in order to really show people that true net zero that balances the need to protect nature can be delivered?
Thanks, Joe, and thanks everyone for taking the time to join us today. It's a really important question, and I'm glad you articulated it quite clearly, that we are in a time scale now where we're moving from ambition being the test to delivery being the test. And I kind of think that it's often misunderstood that the transition to net zero is one transition, whereas in reality it's a superposition of multiple different energy, technology and behavioral transitions, and all of those individual transitions rightly operate on different timescales. So we see some in which we've already kind of gone through the scale-up phase and we've reached mass market. So we've got certain choices individuals can make, or businesses can kind of incentivize their employees to sort of take different modes of transport or other behavioral changes. We see the transition to renewable power. We've phased out coal power generation. We've halved the use of gas power generation. That's delivered an 82% reduction in emissions from our power generation sector since 2008. So we're already at the scale where businesses can deliver real action through those sorts of things, through procuring renewables at scale, through even generating your own power on sites, through encouraging employees and through supply chains to make lower carbon choices. Now we're sort of excitingly, I think we're starting to move to a similar phase on things like electric vehicles, where we see uptake growing. There's about 30% of sales last month were fully electric of new cars. Market is growing. HGV market, if you look to China and places like that, there's a real emerging sense of technological innovation. So in the next few years, lots of businesses, and they already are, will be able to demonstrate real progress by switching fleets over at scale. Heating might not be far behind, heating premises, but also low temperature industrial heat. Heat pumps are an established technology globally for these processes. So there's a real opportunity to demonstrate real credibility over the coming years in these areas too. But I think probably the most exciting is that by the time we get to 2030, we should be entering the foothills of the next set of transitions. So electric technologies for a wider range of industrial processes. Andrew talked about low carbon steel. We also have CCS infrastructure beginning to get up and running, so potential for production of low carbon cement in this country. And new low carbon fuels will increasingly be available. So things, machines, etc., which don't work viably for electrification may have other options beginning to become available at that point. So there'll be a broadening of the range of areas in which businesses can showcase real leadership by 2030. And I think that'll really help demonstrate kind of the credibility of the transition.
Absolutely. And I really love that phrase, it's not just one transition. And I think you're right. We often think it is just this one thing that we're going to move forward in a uniform way, whereas actually it's multiple strands that have to come together. And if we take that concept, it's not just one transition, and we look at that in a project context, Andrew, Lower Thames Crossing, you're, currently attempting to balance multiple transitions: carbon, nature, communities, the economic requirements of delivering a major infrastructure project as well. What have you guys learned today or to date about managing those different transitions and how you can balance the trade-offs in practice?
I think the first thing we've learned is that actually you have to be pretty pragmatic. We can't afford to analyze a whole set of sort of complex trade-offs for every decision. So being very clear about where we're heading, and then trying to make good decisions in the context of that direction, so that you're always trying to make decisions that take you close to that goal. As a sort of methodology for us as a leadership or a management team, or through our design process, actually that has proved more practical probably for us than lots and lots of complex analysis. And I would say, if I took sort of low carbon or net zero in isolation, actually, that agenda is challenging precisely because we want to do it as well as everything else that we were already doing in construction. It's not really a trade-off. We don't want to have less satisfactory infrastructure that's low carbon. We want even better infrastructure that is also low carbon. So if anything, it's sort of it is additive. I personally think that's really exciting, because we're talking about moving to a world where, as a construction industry, we're not polluting the planet, and in which the things we're doing are helping people feel better off. We don't necessarily know every step of the course that gets us to that end game, which is why I say, being clear about where you're headed and helping people make decisions that progress you in that direction is the way that we've found to be most pragmatic. But to give you an example of a big decision we had, we're constructing a couple of very large tunnels underneath the Thames estuary, and we actually decided to lengthen those tunnels to make sure that we were well out of the protected wetlands around the estuary area. So that was a choice that prioritized the natural or prioritized nature, biodiversity over carbon. We're building a bigger tunnel, and that involves more carbon essentially. And on one level, that's a trade-off. But actually, if you think about that as a sequence, the only way we could protect that area for biodiversity was to avoid it. Actually, we then still had an opportunity to take carbon out of that longer tunnel. So in thinking about how we kind of make progress, we're actually able to make decisions sequentially, which hopefully have resulted in a better result in the round across those different dimensions.
And I think that's such a good example of balancing the equation. And of course, if you're making the tunnel longer, you're not just obviously doing it with increasing carbon, doing it at increased cost. And I know that there will be a lot of people on the call today where that's where their discussion, their debate within organizations then falls over. Because, it's not just about we can protect biodiversity, but the carbon goes up. I think a lot of people could understand the need for the equation to look like that. But as soon as you then say, and the cost goes up, then all of a sudden we get that pressure on, oh, right, well, cost going up, well, maybe we've got to relook at that equation. So how did you get your stakeholders on board when you said, look, the first step of the mitigation hierarchy is you avoid, we need to avoid the damage first before we then look to mitigate, and you've achieved that so successfully. How did you get them on board with the cost paradigm of that equation?
I mean, you're right. A lot of people, I would say, go to cost quite quickly, as surely all of this is going to cost more. That hasn't really been our experience. We took the first 50% of the carbon out of our plans at no cost. And in fact, I'd argue we probably saved money across that first part of the journey because we're really engaging people's brains in a different way. We've always asked for the lowest cost, please optimize your designs. But actually, putting a carbon lens on it just sort of got people thinking in perhaps a slightly different or more creative way. So we think we certainly got that first 50% for free. We're now pushing into the next sort of 20-25%. We're trying to get to 70% reduced. And actually, some of the things that we want to do cost more in their own right. And the best example of something that's always going to cost more, if you're going to do carbon capture on a cement works, it's always going to be more expensive than a chimney, right? But it does give you a product which is exactly the same construction product that you had before. So in the toolkit, that's a really helpful thing to have. But we get that cost back in different ways. So we see it absolutely as an investment. And we're we're driving an innovation agenda here into an industry that actually deliberately doesn't innovate very quickly. And we, there are reasons why construction is sort of set up to innovate slowly. And that muscle just doesn't really get exercised. And this agenda is giving us an opportunity to really exercise that. And you start seeing the benefit of that in terms of the levels of engagement you get from the team, the ability to recruit, the ability to retain people once you've brought them in, the kind of energy there is around design and what people are doing, and the alignment they're finding, or the sense of purpose they're giving in solving a big, a generational problem. Actually, people really want to get involved in that, and that's true of businesses as much as it is of individuals. So, I would say this is, we do a lot which actually saves us money. There are some things which have actually a relatively modest incremental cost. We're talking small percentages. But the return that we get on that investment, even in isolation, as a project that's really trying to push the boundaries, actually, we think is huge. But not everyone has to be right at the bleeding edge. You can take one step back, and essentially, I would say you're probably in a cost neutral position, but you're still doing much better on some of these carbon or other environmental issues than the sort of average.
Yeah, and you would have done otherwise. No, thank you, Andrew. And I particularly like your point about, you make a fair assessment, but I think you were maybe a little bit too generous. Within construction, we are slow to innovate. We're sort of known for it. We do have very established ways of working. There are reasons for that, as you said, that are fully understandable. There's other reasons actually that aren't so understandable. We need to give ourselves a little bit of a kick up the backside and go a bit faster, because otherwise we are going to end up in this situation of having a gap between what we're trying to achieve versus what we're able to achieve on the ground. And I think there's a number of us in the industry are getting a bit concerned about where this gap is going to lie. How big is it going to be? And Owen, I'm interested from, again, the UK perspective. Are you starting to see a gap appear between commitments that organizations are making versus what they might practically, feasibly, economically be able to achieve by the time they get to their target deadlines?
So our role at the CCC is to assess sort of UK-wide progress. So what we tend to do is assess kind of at a more macro scale than business by business. So I can't really answer in terms of gaps between business plans and what we're actually seeing delivered. But what I can answer is gaps between kind of UK-wide plans and what's actually being delivered. And that's kind of the core of our progress report, which we presented to Parliament 2 weeks ago. And in a sense, what it flags is that there's a bit of a distinction emerging between the generation supply of low carbon power, in which things are going broadly quite well, and the other things where we should be kind of on an upward path, but we're not yet. In particular, electrification, particularly of heating for buildings and of heat in industry. And the government, and in fact many businesses, have lots of positive commitments, lots of ambition in these areas. So at the government level, we've got the Warm Homes Plan, we've got a commitment on industry to make electric options the economically rational choice across many industries. But current progress isn't really living up to those claims. And so to put a few numbers on it, on heat pump installations in existing homes, the growth rate fell from 56% last year, which was quite good year on year, to only 7% last year. So we're not kind of continuing the ramp up. And there are key policy gaps in public and commercial buildings and in low-income homes. And currently, we think the plans aren't sufficient to deliver the scale up that we need to reduce and remove emissions from this really critical sector. The same is true in industry. Despite some notable and quite high-profile actions, particularly around Port Talbot, where we have the electric arc furnace being constructed now, the rate of electricity use in industry has remained pretty flat, around 27-28% of energy use in industry for the last sort of 5-10 years or so. And it really needs to start growing if we're going to be able to produce products in a low carbon way, because ultimately both our analysis and the government's analysis recognize that electrification is the big ticket solution in a lot of areas, not all areas, but a lot of areas. And of course, many of you on the call will be very familiar with a big barrier to this, which is high electricity prices, both internationally, comparing ourselves internationally, it's sort of a competitive challenge, but also domestically, the ratio of electricity to gas prices per unit energy delivered is about 4-1, which for a lot of electric technologies means they're not quite in the money for making that switch. And that means we're asking firms to incur upfront costs, we're asking firms to incur hassle for something that's not necessarily going to pay back immediately. Now, there are some ways around this, things like solar panels, flexible energy tariffs, things like that. But ultimately, we think the government needs to take more action to make electricity cheaper, to address this and enable these transitions to happen faster.
I don't think anybody on the call is going to complain about their electricity bills going down. I think we're all feeling it, aren't we? And but I think you're sort of touching on a theme, and that I suppose leads to a concern that I have, which is if we've got these gaps appearing both at business level and at UK level, I suppose the danger there is that as we start to face into the realities of climate change, I mean we're all experiencing a very hot summer in the UK at the moment. If we then see renewed pressure from customers, employees, government policy, investors who decarbonize, is that potentially going to push organizations and individuals down the wrong behaviors, in the sense of, all right, might be low carbon, but there might be greater impacts elsewhere? And that sort of takes us nicely onto our second theme for today's discussion, which is really looking at achieving net zero needs to be done in the context of understanding the whole life impact of the solution or the change that you're trying to drive. So Julia, we've teased at the nature theme a little bit already this afternoon, but from your perspective and with your years of expertise in this area, what does a genuine whole life approach to an innovation, a change, a new way of working look like?
Oh, Joe, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question. And Andrew, I really like your point about the data, because my first point was we've got to measure what matters. So we do have to measure the biodiversity footprint of our efforts and actions to get to net zero. I need to measure the change in carbon sequestration when I'm doing biodiversity net gain, but we can't drown in data, and we can't let perfect be the enemy of the good, constantly chasing that perfect data set. So Andrew, I really, really liked your point about and Joe, to answer your question, I think we need a much better handle of what is good enough data, which isn't going to be perfect, but we need to make decisions because we're in a nature and climate crisis. This is an emergency that we need to address. So I think the first thing, Joe, to answer your point, is measuring what matters, good enough evidence and data, but taking action and making decisions. And also, Joe, to answer your point, I think actually contractors do innovate and you do work given all the pressures that you are, but we need to learn and continually improve. We might not necessarily have all the answers, but it's taking those actions and continuous improvement. And just to give you an example from the nature perspective, so we have biodiversity net gain coming, which is going to be mandatory for major infrastructure projects from this November. And that's such a milestone. But if you look at all of our biodiversity impacts across the value chain, across the supply chain, it's like reaching Everest Base Camp. We are creating wildlife-rich habitats, we're creating more, but we're not measuring all of our biodiversity impacts in our value chain and supply chain. And from a nature perspective, one of the things that we're doing is learning so much from the carbon community, because you've done that. Andrew, as you said, it's incredibly challenging. And I think the nature community needs to up the game. So we started off by thinking of, hey, what does that biodiversity footprint look like? And there's some fantastic, really interesting work coming through on biodiversity footprinting. And we didn't want to generate more data sets. So how do we do a biodiversity footprint that actually uses data that the carbon team have collected, or social value, or circular economy, or waste, and start to get a handle on the biodiversity footprint? And when we did so, when we've done this on a couple of projects now, I was thinking about it from a nature perspective, but it gave us that insight into actually, hang on a sec, from a net zero perspective, we've looked at the biodiversity consequences of reducing your carbon emissions, and that one's going to be better. So it gives us that ability, that 360 viewpoint to say, well, if we look at the land increase and habitats, and that's one thing, if we match a biodiversity footprint with a carbon calculation, and again, there's some great tools coming down the line that are doing this. It's not perfect, but it's getting there. It's not just from a biodiversity point of view. I can now provide those insights into what is the best approach to get to net zero. And I'm really interested in this discussion about electricity, because one of the aspects that we have, if we look at wind farms and solar farms and all those things, what do they need? They need land. Now that land would be amazing for biodiversity. There's some really great work about how solar farms and delivering all these like species-rich grassland, or it could not be. So we constantly have to think, are we thinking 360 without tripping up in terms of mountains of data, without worrying that we don't have the best data and there's someone going to criticize what we're doing, but to start and to explore those and then get better and better over time. So to answer your question, Joe, I think firstly, the nature community has so much to learn from the net zero, because we need to up the game. Yes, we've got biodiversity net gain coming, but we urgently need to measure and assess our biodiversity impacts upstream and across our supply chain, and looking at those biodiversity footprinting tools. When we do so, we get that idea of actually, from a net zero perspective, out of all of the options that you've got, what are the consequences for biodiversity? Because there is a biodiversity footprint and an impact on reaching net zero. And how do we then square the circle? But also bringing in, like circular economy, reducing our water use, all of those are reducing pressures on nature. So I am going to say this, but if we have nature as that top level target, it helps us, because if we do the right things for circular economy, it then helps restore nature. But just a final point, and Andrew, I really like your point about your people aspect. When we've done this biodiversity footprinting work, actually one of our amazing early career professionals was working on it, and she's in our carbon team because it's based on life cycle assessments and everything. So she's starting her career in carbon, but already thinking about nature. So for her, that's great, because she's like, why wouldn't you think about nature? So I think there's a real opportunity to make sure that we're not just tinkering around the edges with this like nature discussion or carbon discussion. We're really bringing that, but bringing along the next leaders who will then take that into the business with them.
And I think you make such a great point, Julia, as well about the data and how we measure progress on net zero today. It is very narrow. It's carbon out. essentially, materials in, carbon out, energy in, carbon out, etc. So having a richer tapestry of measures of KPIs around that include nature, water, all of those critical factors, I think would be a really good step in the right direction. And we have actually had a question come through on our Q&A along these lines, which is, for each of you, if you were to give our web attendees today just one piece of advice to help them within their organizations. A lot of people on the call today are responsible for driving the net zero agenda within their organizations. If you could give them one bit of advice so that they could help their projects, their businesses move from ambition to action, what bit of advice would it be? Julia, if I come back to you first, because I think you'll probably have some good input on nature.
Yes, no, certainly. And I will, obviously, there's so much more than just the nature story. But if you truly want to get to net zero, you cannot destroy the environment to save the planet. It doesn't work. So running a biodiversity footprint calculation alongside your carbon calculation, you can use the same data. There's some fantastic biodiversity footprinting tools. So you're not drowning in data, you're just understanding the biodiversity consequence of getting to net zero. And it just enables you to push that door, and it unlocks innovation that you haven't seen before. So it's a fantastic way. And there's something about nature that people respond to really well as well. So I think that joining up that piece, so use the same data, run a biodiversity footprint, and have that joined up discussion, because then you get more bang for your buck.
Love that, Julia. Thank you. Andrew, what one bit of advice would you give the individuals listening today?
I mean, a bit of advice is really, I guess it's about leadership as much as anything else. And it would be, don't wait for permission. I come across a lot of people who really worry about this agenda, but haven't realized that actually they could do something about it today. You're not going to solve everything all at once, but actually you can do something today. So don't wait for someone to tell you.
I'm forever telling my team, Andrew, to beg forgiveness, don't ask for permission, and it is very funny when they end up doing that to me. You say you told us, don't ask for permission, but you are absolutely right. I love that point about just take action. And Owen, one bit of advice that you would give our attendees today.
I've got two. Firstly, practical. Think about what you can electrify. These are the technologies that are available today and often surprisingly cost competitive already. So those are the tech actions you can often take. And then the second is tell us what worked and what didn't work, and be transparent, be open. I think there's a lot for all of us to learn from each other, and seeing real action and progress, and hearing about it from Andrew, for instance, really inspiring, but also hearing about what didn't work and why is important to try and address and resolve barriers and make sure everyone can move as we need to.
Make a good point there around transparency, and I'd like to pull sort of two themes together here, because Andrew, you're sort of opening the door to have a conversation about leadership, which I think is a really important theme of today's discussion, and Owen, your comment about transparency. Is transparency becoming the new test of leadership, and should organizations be more open to where we are potentially falling short? Because I think this is something that the reputational part of the equation is something that a lot of organizations are struggling with today. So, if we are to move towards credibly delivering net zero in a whole life perspective, what does the new leadership paradigm for individuals, businesses, and countries need to look like? And Andrew, if I come to you on that first, please.
I mean, yes, fundamentally, transparency is important because we need to build trust here, and particularly in the context of lots and lots of ambition being declared, with perhaps plans for delivery being a bit thin. Actually, we do need to be transparent about what we've done and what's worked and what hasn't. I think it's really important. We need to innovate fast, and the best mistakes to learn from are the ones that someone else made. So it's super helpful at a sort of more system-wide level if you've got access to other people's learning very, very quickly, and it's cheaper for all of us in the round. I think it does bring a communication challenge, because actually we're trying to move towards an economy that operates a little bit differently. It needs to be a better economy, and we need to be helping other people move as well. So I think, yes, we do need to be clear about what's worked and what hasn't, but let's be positive about what we learn from that and where we go next.
Thank you, Andrew. Julia, what are your thoughts on leadership around the net zero agenda?
I think it's giving a platform for our younger leaders as well, because they're growing up with the technologies, the AI, the tools, and we constantly talk about, can AI help solve the nature crisis and the climate crisis? But if we use more AI, there's more data centers, there's more water use, and again, we're coming back to that paradox between relying on technologies to save the planet, but those technologies have a biodiversity and take up, a net zero challenge as well. So it's leadership, but also giving our younger leaders a voice and hearing from them the direction, because very soon they'll be having these webinars instead of us. I think from a nature perspective, we cannot do this alone. And Andrew, what you talked about, the transition to that. So that transparency and the sharing what doesn't learn, I think it's a really important discussion, because I've seen people be so afraid of being accused of greenwashing that they then don't take action for nature, which is the worst situation. And Joe, again, I really want to thank you for opening up this discussion, because we cannot achieve these challenges on our own. This is the climate and nature crisis. We're bringing our industry to the table in a bold and ambitious way and working out what that looks like. But we can't be at risk of not failing to take action because we're too scared of being criticised for doing so. So that partnership approach with all sectors, bringing people along with us, government, research, academia, stakeholders, NGOs, and actually looking at this from a whole systems approach, but in terms of the systems as we work together with our community.
100%, Julia. Absolutely agree with you. And I think we often forget, don't we, that leadership doesn't just happen at the very top. Leadership can actually happen and be really effective from the most junior members of our team. And I think it is the young people that are going to be really holding organizations to account on what they're trying to deliver around the carbon and nature crisis. Owen, what are you seeing any shifts in the way, in the leadership paradigm around the net zero agenda, or any shifts that you think need to happen in order to accelerate progress?
I mean, I think one of the real opportunities for young leaders, emerging leaders, is to bring all of these things together. We've talked about them as separate transitions, but Julie, you've made the really strong point that these are really one and the same, and how we take actions that deliver synergies that benefit all is, I think, the real opportunity of the next sort of 10, 15, 20 years. I mean, we can see it in our analysis. You can see action for nature is beneficial for climate. A properly re-wetted peatland sequesters more carbon than a dried out one. Planting the right trees in the right places not only sucks up carbon, but also provides sort of green spaces that are cooler than urban jungles rather than real jungles. And if you look at our other piece of recent advice, our well-adapted UK report, it's clear that the UK isn't designed for the climate we're now facing, let alone the climate we're going to face in 25 years' time or more. And so the actions that are taken now not only need to think about how they reduce carbon, but they also need to think about how they protect nature and how they make sure that we don't need to go back and revisit these infrastructure investments in 20 years because sea levels have risen or heat waves are now more pronounced and more regular. And so we need to make sure we take all of these actions into account. And I think that's the real test of proper leadership.
And the actions that we need to take is sort of a nice way to sort of move to our final theme of the session, which is that sort of that delivery at scale. And a lot of major infrastructure projects, Andrew, you've touched on this a bit as well, act as test beds for the innovations that we are trying to develop and drive and implement at scale, so that to your point, Owen, we don't end up with infrastructure that we're building today that isn't fit for purpose 25 or 30 years down the line. But one of the real challenges of being a test bed and driving these innovations is you learn just as much from things that don't work as you learn from things that do. And the challenge around sharing those lessons. And we've had a great question come through in the chat to our panelists to ask, I think there is a recognition, particularly in construction, that these lessons tend to remain buried on the projects in question rather than being shared more widely. So the question coming through is, how can we better share these lessons learned, not just the success stories that we do love to shout about, but also the things that don't work, so that we can save others a bit of time going down the same path. Because these tend to get stuck not just on specific projects, but if we look wider, the lessons learned tend to get stuck in specific institutes or asset bodies, etc. So how would you like to see those lessons better shared? Owen, if I come to you on that one first, please.
Sure. So from our organization's perspective, as an advisor to government, it's hugely useful to understand where things are falling short and, most importantly, why, because that helps us really formulate recommendations to government on what needs to change. And so what I'd like to see is, and I think this should begin to happen more and more, when we're kind of making annual reports as organizations on progress towards delivering on those stated ambitions, can we set out, these are the good actions we've taken, and these are the outcomes that have been delivered, as kind of separate things, like, because you can genuinely take positive, promising, well-intentioned actions that don't necessarily deliver the outcomes you aim for. And sometimes that might be through something that's gone wrong in your own processes, but more often than not, it's because you've uncovered something within the system that needs to be fixed. And so if that's something that we as an organization can advise government on, whether it's sort of making sure government gets out of the way or making sure government brings in new regulations or policy to enable those changes to happen, we're very, very keen to help with that as much as possible.
Can I come in there? Because I think it's a really important point.
Absolutely, Julia, please.
I do really agree with you, but we just don't live in that industry or that environment. If you look at biodiversity net gain, when it came in under Town and Country Planning Act, there was a moment where it got heavily criticised. And we still, I think it comes back to your point about the different transitions, and one of them is cultural. And I think we're still nervous about talking about things that have gone wrong. And I think it's these brilliant webinar sessions, and Joe, thank you for holding this, that actually there's a real power in having an open communication. But I think I wish we were in that element, and that we were, but we have social media where suddenly a few people having a bit of a challenge on biodiversity net gain suddenly turns into, isn't it the worst thing ever? It just escalates. But social media can be a force for good. But I think we've got a long way to get there where we can have an open reporting system about this. And I think it's actually individuals coming together. I've always believed in the power of conversation, and going out on site and actually talking about it and having that collaboration to get to that point where we can genuinely report there. But I worry, I've just seen it where companies are brave enough to talk about mistakes they've made, and then they get criticised for doing so. And I think it's going to take hopefully more of a movement and a shift to be able to get us to that stage.
I agree with that.
Absolutely.
I think that there is a cultural challenge around that. That's the way why I framed it the way I did, that we need to see the positives of actions as being positive irrespective of outcomes.
Well put, Owen. Well put. And I think that Andrew, I'm looking to you now. Lower Thames Pathfinder, right? Pathfinder project. It really is. You're doing some incredible things on there. But we're with you shoulder to shoulder, and we're in the middle of the lessons that we're learning. Some things that are great. other things that we think, that didn't quite pan out how we were hoping it would do. So have you guys put some thought into how you're going to be able to share those great success stories, the tangible asset that we talked about, people can touch and feel, but also sharing the wider stories of this is what didn't work, or this is where we got stuck, or this is where we ended up in a really tricky conversation. Have you guys put thoughts into how you're going to share both?
Yeah, I mean, so we think there are lots of different mechanisms here, actually, and I agree with Julia. Actually, a lot of this is in the people, and people will take what they learn and apply it somewhere else, and we should see that kind of organic process as being inherently valuable, as much as having some sort of incredible data storage system which gives you all the knowledge. Designers are excellent at this because they do best practice. So once they've developed something and implemented it, actually, they tend to be really quite good at spreading it and deploying it across their business. And then it becomes business as usual, and it's just the easiest way to do it, right? So I think that's something that happens in many organizations, but actually in my experience, the sort of engineering design community is actually quite strong at that. But I think there is also this element of actually you just have to be brave and shout about it. If things have gone well, get out there and tell people. Inevitably, this is an agenda that attracts quite a lot of attention, and you might have to deal with bad press or sort of difficult conversations off the back of it. But actually, if things are working, if you've got things to say, then get out there and say it. And in the main, I think we have found a positive audience for that, and a real appetite to kind of understand and learn. I do also think, particularly given the nature of the construction industry, that the more you have real tangible things to show people that are physical, actually, that becomes a much easier equation in terms of sharing. The stuff that hasn't worked is inevitably harder. That's an even bigger step to say, yes, we're brave enough to talk about that openly. Again, actually, if you're not confident putting that on your website, there are plenty of places that, there are places where the industry comes together. There are, we have lots and lots of kind of business to business, one-to-one conversations in our supply chain and with our peers. And those are all opportunities to share what's worked and what hasn't.
You make a good point about bravery. I mean, I'll never forget one of the first ever Net Zero weeks that I attended. There was a conference, and two retailers, that I will not name, they stood up to obviously talk about their net zero achievements, and one stood up and detailed how amazing they were and all the wonderful things that they'd done, against a backdrop of some bad press that had come out a few weeks ago about how actually there was a bit of a gap between what they were trying to do and were able to achieve. But they very much stuck on the corporate line of this is all the things we're doing, well, we're great. And there was just death silence from the audience. And then their competitor stood up, and all they did was talk about a very long list of things that they tried that didn't work, but real physical things they could point to and say, we did this, didn't work because, we did this, didn't work because, and they got a standing ovation because of the fresh perspective, and everyone frantically writing everything down. Great, we were thinking about doing that. We won't worry about it now because we know it doesn't work. So, but it was a real mark of courage to stand up and do that when your competitor had just stood up and done the complete opposite, really. So I'll always remember that. But bravery, it's we talk a lot about it, but it sometimes can be hard to find. So we've had some more questions come through into the chat. There is a theme coming through here as well on the chat around data. And how it can potentially be that enabler or hinderer to progress and what we're saying that we're going to deliver, and then how we're actually going to deliver it on the ground. A really interesting question come through around, how we can compare true progress. So a great question from Christopher Price saying, given how dramatically carbon and sustainability data quality has improved in recent years, how can we ensure that future claims of progress or failure to progress are credible when comparing current data with historical baselines that have been measured in a far less accurate and consistent way? And, are we potentially doing ourselves a bit of a disservice? I mean, I know a number of us are trying to measure our Scope 3 emissions, for example. We're still stuck on spend-based data, which isn't accurate at all. How do you, Julia, how do you see organisations trying to square that equation of the baseline data wasn't fit for purpose in the first place?
Yeah, we're actually having that as a very live discussion. So firstly, we've gone through that with the biodiversity metrics. So we've had 10 years of biodiversity metric changes, and Natural England had version 3, version 4, and every time it changed. We're going through that now with biodiversity footprinting because we know the data and the tool is actually going to get better. And I think that it comes back actually to this point about being transparent, because I don't want to let waiting for the perfect data set or waiting for the perfect biodiversity footprint to stop action. So in a way, it's having a comfortable level, being able to assess trends rather than that absolute number. So are your trends going in the right direction? And be able to say, of course, we're going to use better data when it comes in. Of course, we're going to use better tools when it comes in. Like I do see biodiversity footprinting as the next really big exciting thing. It's only going to get better because it's quite simple and basic and starting at the moment. But that doesn't then stop. And I think so long as we can show, the trends are going up, we've now got better data. So our confidence limits with that, but now they're like that, and work on that bit. It's a really, really great question, but let's not take action, and let's just work with what we've got and then monitor the trends in the right direction.
And you've really piqued our audience's interest around biodiversity footprinting. If you were to, if we've got individuals on the call that want to go and do a biodiversity footprint analysis of their project, their organisation, and they're looking for a good start, as you said, not perfect, but a good start, where would you point them? Which footprinting tools would you point them towards, Julia?
So there's a couple of publications without me kind of taking up the rest of our time, because I can get really nerdy about this. So if anyone is interested, please do be in touch. And Joe, I can send you some links. I don't know if it's possible to share them at the end of this, but also I can post them on LinkedIn as well. So there's some great stuff out there. But yeah.
Or maybe we can post them in the Q&A for everybody.
Yeah.
So with a couple of minutes to go, I'd like to firstly thank my panelists, Owen, Andrew, Julia. Your thoughts, your insights have been invaluable, and I'm sure have really helped people that have attended this webinar as to how they're trying to shift from talking about net zero to actually delivering on the ground in a whole life way. But before I let you off the hook and to go and have a well-deserved tea break, I'd just like each one final thought to our attendees today. So, looking at our themes from today around how net zero is going to be judged by delivery, not declarations, sustainability requiring that whole systems thinking, and we need to scale what works, innovations that work as a priority. What would be your final thoughts to our attendees today? Andrew, I'm going to come to you first.
For me, I think it goes with the pragmatism point. Focus. Sustainability is a broad agenda, and it can be crippling. So focus on making progress over perfection, and keep moving a step in the right direction.
Nice. Thank you, Andrew. Owen?
I'll go back to what Andrew said right at the start, which I think you can sum up as think of things as yes and rather than yes but. When you face a challenge, how do we address this and achieve the other goals we were trying to achieve, rather than how do we, or what should we stop doing? It's a constructive rather than destructive approach.
Yes and, not yes but. Love it, Owen. And Julia, to you.
This whole webinar, this whole conversation is about business risk and resilience. I think we need to move from an ESG kind of vibe and narrative. The global loss of nature is a risk to our industry, and getting to nature positive with net zero, this is now actually about industry and performance and resilience as an industry. So I think as we move to that point, this is more than just an ESG discussion. This is about truly what's critical for our industry.
I could not agree more. And my closing thought, actually, Julia, I owe it entirely to you, but I thought it was just the best phrase. You cannot destroy the environment to save the planet. And I think we all have to absolutely have that front and center of our minds. Julia, Andrew, Owen, thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise and your knowledge It's been an absolute pleasure this afternoon. Thank you very much. And thank you to our attendees. Remember, everyone, the session's been recorded. It will be available to rewatch and to share on the Net Zero Week website. Thank you all very much and good afternoon.